Hello, I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record, and welcome to a special edition of Planet Holyrood. I'm in Bute House today, which is the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland. It's been home to every First Minister since the beginning of devolution, and I'm here today to speak to the 7th, John Swinney. And I'm going to ask him the questions on the issues you hold dear, from the NHS to the cost of living crisis to Donald Trump, and of course the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a woman. First Minister, thanks for joining us on Planet Holyrood. Before we start the interview, we do have some news. You've agreed to become a Daily Record columnist, a fortnightly columnist, starting this Monday. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you feel about writing for Daily Record readers?
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to write for the Daily Record and for Daily Record readers. It gives me an opportunity to set out directly in my own words some of what's in my mind, what I'm thinking about, what I'm wrestling with, and some of my priorities about what I'm doing as First Minister. I suppose it also gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how I live my life and the things that bring me joy, and maybe perhaps talk a little bit more about some of what my son gets up to and what we get up to as a family, which will be nice to share, and just to give me a chance to reflect on the issues of the day. So I really welcome the opportunity that the Daily Record's provided me to enable me to do that.
Just to start the interview, there's a big Supreme Court judgment this morning on the legal definition of a woman. The Scottish Government is on the losing side of that argument, that case. What's your response to the decision?
The first thing is that I accept the outcome of the Supreme Court case. I believe in the rule of law, so the right and the immediate thing to do is to accept without question the judgment of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has brought clarity to two pieces of legislation that the Scottish Government was navigating its way through. The Gender Recognition Act, which was passed in 2004 by the UK Parliament, and the Equality Act 2010, again passed by the UK Parliament. And it's brought absolute clarity on that question. So we need to reflect on that ruling. We need to engage constructively with all voices in Scotland about the ruling. And I think it's really important for me at the outset to say that making sure that I need a government that protects the rights of everybody is fundamental to my response to the judgment of the Supreme Court.
Do you think that on behalf of the Scottish Government you owe women an apology?
We've acted in good faith on this question. We've tried to navigate our way through two pieces of legislation, and during which, of course, our position has been supported twice by courts in Scotland in this particular case. So the debate has been around very uncertain areas of definition, and the Supreme Court has concluded on that, and that's an end to the matter. And I don't question it, I accept it. But what we've been trying to do is to navigate our way through what's been legislation that's been difficult to work our way through, and the Supreme Court has given us clarity.
Public resources are not in plentiful supply just now. How much is this going to cost the taxpayer in terms of this case?
But obviously, all that detail will be published in due course. I don't know what the financial implications of a court case that's just concluded today will actually be, because that obviously is determined by judgments that the court makes. But at all times, we should be incredibly careful about the use of public money. It's always been my priority to make sure that public money is well and effectively used, and used for the proper purposes. And of course, as we've navigated our way through some of these questions, our position has been supported by courts. I said a moment ago that on two occasions in the courts in Scotland, our position has been supported. It's not been supported by the Supreme Court. So I think that's an illustration of the fact that there are genuine questions that had to be addressed here. And I suppose that's the justification I would use for the use of public money, that where there are genuine questions to be resolved, we should do that in good faith and use public money wisely.
This is the latest piece of legislation to fall and follow the courts. I won't go through them all, but you've had named person, GRR, and now this one. Are you not worried that there is an impression that MSPs, ministers, they are incompetent legislators?
There's vast amounts of legislation that get passed that that is not in any way, shape or form a challenge in the courts. And the reason for that is because the legislation is beyond dispute. There are obviously issues of intense debate here, and the particular issue with the Supreme Court judgment, I'm sorry to keep on coming back to this point, what's taken us to this point, is obviously the fact that there have been contested points of debate here and points of legislation. And two courts in Scotland found with the Scottish Government, and the Supreme Court has taken the opposite view. So I think that's an illustration of the complexity and the challenge around some of the issues with which we've been wrestling.
Let's turn to the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. It's going to take place on June the 5th. Obviously, it was triggered by the sad death of Christina McKelvey. The Labour government has struggled since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. Do you think it's fair to say that the SNP are the favourites in this by-election?
I don't think so. Obviously, the by-election takes place in really sad circumstances. Like, we're all really still suffering because of the loss of Christina McKelvey. Christina was a unique individual, and she was passionate about her politics, her belief in equalities, her commitment to Scottish independence, but with it, and obviously political to her fingertips. But with Christina, there was such a warmth and generosity of spirit that we were all affected by that. We all loved Christina. We loved being in her company. So we're all finding this really tough. And I wasn't able to be at Christina's funeral on Friday. And sadly, I was at the funeral of my own father-in-law. And so we've had a very direct family bereavement in the last few weeks as well. So it's been a really tough few weeks in that respect. So we're just beginning to come to terms with all of that loss and are now beginning to focus on the by-election. But I don't think by any stretch of the imagination is the by-election outcome clear. We'll have to work incredibly hard in the SNP to retain the constituency. We've faced a tough time as a party. The reason why you're interviewing me in Bute House as First Minister is because we faced a tough time as a party. And I've got to rebuild the Scottish National Party. I'm doing that step by step, but it's important that we all recognise the scale of the challenge that we face in the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election.
What's clear is that reform are on the rise throughout the United Kingdom. You can see what they're polling in England. They've done really well in council by-elections in Scotland. They're predicted to make a breakthrough at Holyrood next year. Just level with our viewers. Do you think that reform have got a chance of winning this by-election? Do you think they're serious contenders?
They could be. It's early days in a by-election, but I think we've got to. I think I've got a job of work to do to say to people in Scotland that they've got to see through Farage, because Farage is only using Scotland as a platform to spread the type of hate and division that he spreads in other parts of the United Kingdom. And I've got a job of work to do to call that out, and I'll do that because it's essential that people in Scotland are given hope about our future. I think the Scottish National Party gives people that hope. I think there's a lot of disappointment in Scotland today because of the performance of the Labour government, a Labour government that promised to address the circumstances of the WASPy women and right that injustice, a Labour government that promised that it would reduce people's energy bills, and it's done neither, and at the same time it's removed the winter fuel payment from pensioners, and it's now mounted an attack on the benefits of some of the most vulnerable people and disabled people in our society. So there's a lot of actions by the Labour government that are making people angry in Scotland today, and I've got to make sure that people in Scotland feel that there is hope offered by the Scottish National Party as an alternative to the hate and the division of Farage.
Could reform win it?
It's early days, but I'm going to make very sure through the efforts of the Scottish National Party, our excellent candidate Katie Loudon, that we do everything to make sure that's not the case, and that the hopeful message of the Scottish National Party is the one that wins through.
You've got an anti-reform summit, I think, next week. that you've called for Scotland to come together and unite against parties and forces like reform. What would your message be to unionist voters who don't support independence in this by-election on how they should vote? Should they vote Labour? Should they vote Conservative and ever keep out reform?
Well, I think, it's up to people to decide how they want to vote. I'll make the positive pitch for people to vote for the Scottish National Party, and I think what I've done as First Minister is bring a focus to the work of the Scottish Government and the SNP. I want to focus us very directly on the priorities of people in Scotland, eradicating child poverty, boosting the economy through growth in jobs, about making sure that we tackle climate change, and crucially, that we improve the National Health Service, that we improve access to GPs, and that we get waiting times down. And that's the agenda that is capturing my thinking and my agenda as First Minister. And I've got to present that positively to people and engage them in the hopeful message that the SNP offers.
You mentioned the positive message, but is it also, in a sense, you want people to vote SNP to stop Farage in his tracks?
Yeah, well, I want to make sure that Farage makes absolutely no headway in Scotland whatsoever. And the SNP has been doing really well at withstanding Farage. There was a lot of speculation that Farage was going to win a by-election in Glasgow in the local authority a few weeks ago. And it was the SNP that stopped him, and we won that by-election. So I think we've got the message, and we've got the politics and the policies that are the antidote to Farage. And what I'm interested in doing is I'm interested in bringing people together. I'm interested in finding common cause and common purpose in Scottish society. And Farage is the opposite of that. He wants to spread division. So my whole focus is on bringing people together and making sure that we create the type of unity and cohesion that's necessary to withstand the threat to our democratic politics and to the values of our society that I think Farage represents.
As things stand, do you fear that Farage is in line to be the next Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think there's a high likelihood that could be the case, yes. And I worry about that very, very much.
What impact would that have on the United Kingdom?
I think the values of the United Kingdom would be changed in an incredibly damaging way, and the values of the United Kingdom would change fundamentally in how it's perceived around the world, and that would be bad for all of us.
I was in Bute House earlier this week. You had a press conference, and your announcement was that you're bringing forward the programme for government, which is your legislative plan in response to the global chaos that we're seeing just now in the economy, which, let's face it, is down to Donald Trump's tariffs. What can your devolved government do to mitigate the consequences of those tariffs? It's not just gesture politics or symbolism.
We can pursue an agenda of substance around trying to make sure Scotland's protected from the economic effects of that as far as we can within our powers. And, we've talked long enough over the years, Paul, about the fact that we operate within a limited scope. So there's certain things that are beyond our limits. A trade deal, for example, between the United Kingdom and the United States is not something that I can negotiate. That is negotiated by the UK government. But earlier on today, I had a gathering around the cabinet table in Bute House here of various representatives of businesses and business organisations and trade union interests around the country to just hear from them what are the practical steps that they would like to see the Scottish Government take. And I suppose there's a few measures that we can take. First of all, we can make Scotland as competitive as we possibly can do by investing in skills, so that we've got a skilled population base that can make the most of the economic opportunities that we have. Secondly, we could do what I was doing in the United States just over a week or so ago, which is actually pursue specific investment opportunities with international investors to bring investment here into Scotland. And we've done really well over the years in attracting investment into Scotland. And just a few weeks ago, we had a really successful offshore energy investment conference here in Edinburgh, and with over 100 investors here looking at specific investment propositions. So we can make sure that we're attracting investment. One of the conclusions I came to from my visit in the United States was that while there's a lot of uncertainty and turmoil because of the tariffs debate, there's still organisations wanting to invest in Scotland because the opportunities haven't changed. The opportunities of offshore energy haven't changed. The opportunities in food and drink investment haven't changed. So we've just got to make sure we continue to nurture those relationships. And the third thing we've got to do is to make sure that we've got a really supportive business environment to help companies to navigate their way through these challenges. And that's always been an issue that I've been interested in. It was where I'm my political spurs dealing with economic issues, sort of long-serving finance and economy minister here in Scotland. So making sure we do the right things by the economy is central to what the Scottish Government can do.
The Prime Minister's strategy when it comes to President Trump seems to be don't criticise him in public and try and use leverage and influence behind the scenes, maybe to get a trade deal, try and get the tariffs reduced. Do you think that strategy is the correct one? Is that what you would do if you were in his position?
I think we've got to proceed with an awful lot of care. So I understand why the Prime Minister is proceeding in the way that he is, and I generally agree with the direction, the travel that we're taking. We've got to be careful, because even if we look in, the tariff announcement was 2 weeks ago today. In the intervening period, that tariff announcement has changed quite dramatically. So we're in a period of shifting sands. So keeping a calm soup about all that's going on is a wise approach in my view. And try to take the necessary steps that we can take, and some of the things that I was just talking to them in my previous answer, about making sure that we continue that dialogue with international investors so that they see us as being interested in investment propositions, interested in making common cause with different investors, so we can bring jobs into Scotland. And that's what's going to influence my approach. I think there's also importance around the Scottish Government being closer to the thinking of the UK Government about a trade deal. And I don't want to find myself in this. I don't know the proposed contents of a trade deal with the United States. And I don't want to find myself on a fait accompli that gives me real difficulty in the Scottish economy. And there are issues where that could be the case, And so I think the more we can have a deeper conversation with the UK Government about what might be a trade deal, the better it'll be for the work between our two governments, so that we can get to a position that Scotland's interests are protected and asserted in any trade deal that comes forward.
When you became First Minister last year, you said that your number one priority was eradicating child poverty, and one of your main policies to that effect was the one you announced in the budget, effectively mitigation payments for the two-child benefit cap. Now, can you guarantee to low-income families that they will get those payments in their bank account April next year?
Yes.
Even though you need legislation from the UK Government and you're relying on the data they provide?
I think the principal issue is about data, and that work is underway. That cooperation is being taken forward to develop the systems. Now, I recognise these things take time, which is why I think some of the calls that were made for us to deliver this benefit now, having just announced it in December, were completely ludicrous. We need to take time to get all the systems in place. You need the data to do so. We're dependent on the UK Government to do that. As things stand just now, I've got no issues with the flow of data, and we're in dialogue with the UK Government about these questions. So we've got to just work our way through that to get to the point, because that measure matters. We're having a conversation here about sort of rather dry topics about data and data handling. What it means is that it will help to lift children and families out of poverty when we implement this policy. And I take enormous encouragement from the fact that we have seen children and families kept out of poverty because of innovative measures such as the Scottish Child Payment. I want to make sure we continue to take those measures because, as you rightly say, I set out that the driving purpose in our government would be to eradicate child poverty. We're making headway. We're seeing child poverty levels reduce in Scotland, but not reducing as fast as I would like to see them. And indeed, some of the measures the Labour government are proposing to take are going to make our challenge even greater. Now, I'm aghast that I find myself in a situation where a Labour government is going to make my challenge of reducing child poverty in Scotland more difficult than it was beforehand. But that in no way will detract me from pursuing what I think is an absolutely central necessity in Scotland today.
Do you agree that if the next Holyrood election was determined by the NHS and SNP government's performance in the NHS, that the SNP will lose the next election?
No, I don't, because I think we are taking forward a lot of steps to strengthen the National Health Service in the aftermath of what was an incredibly damaging and disruptive period in COVID. Well, the COVID period, I suppose, was two parts to it. There was the incredible realignment of National Health Service activity to protect the population to an extraordinary degree, with members of NHS staff going to amazing lengths to protect members of the public. But the aftermath of the second part is obviously the implications of the delays to treatments that took place as a consequence of COVID. So we are building back out of that, and we are now seeing progress being made as a consequence of the focus that's been brought to the strengthening of the National Health Service. And I'm seeing improvements in the data and the information. It's got the work to improve the National Health Service is absolutely central to my government's agenda. And I meet members of the public on a regular basis who speak with warmth and admiration of the experience they've had in the National Health Service. I also meet members of the public who are waiting too long for treatment, and I'm doing everything I can to try to address that. And of course, central to that has been the investment the government's put into the NHS in the recent budget, where we put in a record funding settlement to strengthen the delivery of the National Health Service.
I speak to friends and family, and they're waiting on treatment. They can't get an appointment with their GP. There's chaos in the social care service. They're scared about ever having to rely on A&E because they know they're going to have to wait for hours on end. And isn't it the case that the SNP have had their chance on the NHS and they've failed?
I think the National Health Service performs very, very strongly. I want to see it performing ever stronger. I want to see it delivering lower waiting times. I want to see it delivering better access to GPs. But if you look at A&E waiting times, for example, over 1 million people in Scotland are treated in A&E within 4 hours. It's a remarkable turnaround within the National Health Service. Now, it's not as good as I would like it to be, but it's an incredible performance. We're seeing waiting times in imaging processes, for example, falling. We're seeing an increase in the number of procedures being undertaken. So we put £30 million into the NHS extra in the last financial year to secure about 64,000 extra procedures. Over a 10-month period, we deliver 75,500 extra procedures. So the final 12-month total will be far in excess of the 64,000 that we put in place. So I've tried to be as candid and as open as I can about NHS performance, or I've tried to be as candid as open about everything since I became First Minister, just to tell her the way it is. I think there are challenges in the NHS, but I think there's also formidable performance, and I want to build on that.
I asked you earlier this year at an event at one of the universities in Edinburgh, can you guarantee that Neil Gray will still be Health Secretary in the autumn? And you said yes. So I'll ask you again, will Neil Gray still be Health Secretary in the autumn?
Yes, and I think the reason why you should be confident about that answer is because the last question you asked me, and the fact that, well, events, essentially addressed your question, that Neil was the Health Secretary over the time that you asked me, and he still is, and he will be in the autumn.
Are you going to have a reshuffle before the election, given that you've got ministers coming back? And
Obviously I've got some ministerial changes and issues that I have to address. I've obviously lost one of my ministers. Christina McKelvey sadly passed away. So and Mary McCallan, my net zero secretary, is currently on maternity leave and will come back. So there'll have to be some changes to the ministerial team, but it's not an issue that's preoccupying my thinking.
A couple of personal questions. You were Alex Salmond's finance secretary, and then when Nicola Sturgeon was FM, you were education secretary, her DFM, I think COVID recovery as well. Does part of you ever think that during that period in government that you were maybe in their shadow, and now that you're FM, you got out of their shadow?
It's interesting. I suppose you've been doing for a long time, Paul, and you would see me in my time as SNP leader 20 years ago. And I'd be the first to accept that my period as SNP leadership, in SNP leadership 20 years ago, it was not the greatest period for the SNP. And I came out to government in 2007 and I really found my feet. I gave it my best. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that. I gave it my best. It's kind of the greatest privilege I could ever have to serve my country as a government minister. And I just did my level best at all times, supported my first ministers to make sure they could be successful because I wanted them to succeed, because if they succeeded, my party was likely to succeed. I find myself now in the unlikely position of being SNP leader and First Minister, and I suppose all of that experience is, I suppose, what you're now seeing at play, that the growth in my confidence about how to handle difficult issues, which I acquired as a government minister, probably strengthened me to exercise political leadership. So I feel very much at ease in what I'm doing now, and it's sitting comfortable with me.
Let's imagine that Humza Yousaf was still First Minister and you're still on your gap year or your sabbatical, whatever description
I can conjure up.
Do you think, is it likely that you would have been standing down next year along with Nicola Sturgeon and Swinney Robertson?
I would have probably thought about it, yeah. I don't think it's a secret, but when I stood down from office in 2023, I stood down happily. I thought I'd been 16 years a senior government minister, so I'd given a long length of time, and I kind of, as I say, I stood down happily and willingly and voluntarily. So I was very comfortable doing that. So I probably would have turned my mind to what lay ahead. Would I stand for election again? I've loved being a member of the Scottish Parliament. I've been here since the foundation. So it would have been a big range, but I think I would have been turning my mind to that. But just for the record, I'm not turning my mind to that now.
Just a question, John Swinney, as a father, everyone's talking about Adolescence, the Netflix drama. What are your reflections on it? Because it's one of these programmes that's got real cut through. People are talking about it in pubs, in family homes. It's really, it's raised some profound issues.
I think it is relevant and important, and I think I recognise all that you say about its cut through. I think as a father, a 14-year-old son just now, the environment which he has to experience worries me at times. And he's like all other teenagers of his age group. He's got his phone, he's engaged on his phone. I don't think I'm revealing a family secret to say that causes anxiety for my wife and I. But I think what's important is that we create a supportive environment in which he lives, so that some of the issues that are raised in adolescence are not issues that we confront by acknowledge the reality of them.
Just we had a Labour MP, Joni Reid, write us a piece a couple of weeks ago about adolescence, and she had a number of ideas for tackling with the issues raised, and one of them was a clampdown or even a ban on the sale of smartphones to under 16s. I was just wondering if you thought there was merit to that.
I think I understand the sentiment, and I don't in any way dismiss the motivation of the sentiment. I think what adolescence goes up for us all is a lot of questions in our mind about what are the implications of smartphones and about all that smartphones represent in terms of the connection between young people. You know, I can think of connections that my son has made which are possible to be sustained because of the fact that he and all his peers have got smartphones in a way that in my generation it wasn't possible to sustain those type of connections. So that's the good upside. The downside is that, of course, there can be a lot of damage done to young people by their interaction with smartphones. So I think that's a long way of me saying that I understand the point, the aspiration that's been set out, but I think to me it would be inconceivable how we could get to that point, having been where we are. Now, there is a point where it is appropriate, or I should say this, inappropriate for children to have smartphones. See, I don't think. I think the first phone that our son had, he was probably in P7. It might have been just about the summer as he was going to secondary school. Maybe he's travelling away from home to go to secondary school on a daily basis. And so, so there are legitimate debates that families will have about the appropriateness of smartphones and all that goes with them. But I think a supportive family environment is crucial to help young people navigate their way through some of these issues and challenges.
A couple of final questions. Independent strategy. Would it be fair to say that given that you're not producing a series of dates, milestones, in the same way that Nicola Sturgeon did, that part of your strategy for independence is essentially watching the Labour government fail?
What my strategy is about building self-confidence in Scotland and pointing out what independence would enable us to do. So if you just take recent events, the Labour government managed to find itself in a position to act very swiftly to intervene in the situation in Scunthorpe to secure the future of the steel industry in the United Kingdom. Now that's the type of, now you need the size and scope of and the powers of a UK government to enable that to be undertaken. Well, where's that been for Grangemouth? It's not doing this. It's been nowhere to be seen. That's an illustration to me of the difference independent Scotland could make, that we could act emphatically to secure our national interests. So I'll take opportunities to demonstrate and illustrate to people why independence will create new opportunities for Scotland. And that's the way I will sell the case, because fundamentally, we will only win Scottish independence when people in Scotland want Scotland to be independent. And I've got to constantly build up the argument and the support for independence, which is exactly what I'm doing.
You mentioned Grangemouth, but the UK government did announce, I think, the £200 million of funding in terms of the regeneration of Grangemouth. That's not to be sniffed at.
It's welcome, but it's not what's been delivered for Scunthorpe. And Grangemouth refinery is going to close, and that will have a significant economic impact on Scotland. And my point is simply that an independent Scotland would have greater scope to act than we have in a devolved parliament, and the illustration and the contrast of the situation between Grangemouth and Scunthorpe is something which I think is not lost on the people of Scotland.
Finally, you've been in government since 2007, almost on an uninterrupted basis. What would you say is your biggest regret as a minister during that period?
I think I know there's always a temptation to push politicians into their regrets, and maybe the right mode for that is to reflect on those when you're well out of office. I'm in office and I'm giving my best to build the best future I can for Scotland, and that's where my attention always has been and always will be.
Do you have any qualms, any criticisms of Nicola Sturgeon for fact that she's now making a lot of money through her book and then charging £75 a head for a meet and greet?
Well, Nicola gave really clear and emphatic leadership to Scotland through some really difficult and challenging times, particularly, especially during the COVID pandemic. And she's made clear that she's standing down from politics, she's pursuing the next stage of her life, and I wish her well.
You knew Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon very well. Who do you think was the better First Minister, Sturgeon or Salmond?
Well, Swinney is aspiring to be the best First Minister he can be.
Thank you.